They thought the guns would end the war, but on the Somme, they ended something else. It wasn't just men who marched into battle that summer of 1916. It was machines, factories, and the full weight of the industrial age. For 7 days and nights, the earth burned beneath 1.5 million shells. The generals believed nothing could survive. But when the smoke cleared, the enemy was still there, waiting. July the 1st, 1916, the dawn of the Somme Offensive. A battle meant to break the deadlock, to crush the German line, to prove that modern firepower could achieve what courage alone could not. Instead, it became something else, a test of how far humanity could go in building its own destruction. This is the story of the Somme Offensive, 1916, the first great experiment in industrial warfare, where courage met machinery, and the earth itself became a weapon. July 1st, 1916, 7:28 a.m. 150,000 British soldiers stand ready. The earth shakes. The sky turns orange. 1 million shells have fallen, and the generals believe nothing can survive. And then, the whistles blow. Tens of thousands climb out of the trenches, expecting to walk across a silent wasteland. But the guns are not silent. The German machine guns are waiting. And within 1 hour, the Somme becomes a slaughterhouse. By mid-1916, Europe had been locked in war for nearly 2 years. On the Western Front, the lines had barely moved since 1914. The Germans held strong defensive positions across northern France, while to the south, the French army was dying at Verdun, where Falkenhayn's bleeding strategy had turned the battlefield into a meat grinder. The Allies needed to act. They needed a new offensive to relieve pressure on Verdun and to break the stalemate. The chosen sector was a quiet 30-mile front along the river Somme between Albert and Péronne, flat, open farmland that generals believed was perfect for a breakthrough. The British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, and his French counterpart, Joffre, agreed. The Somme would be the decisive test of industrial might. The goal was not merely to win ground, but to crush the enemy's morale through overwhelming firepower. It would be, as Haig promised, the great experiment of modern war. For 7 days before the attack, British and French artillery unleashed the largest bombardment in history. More than 1.5 million shells were fired, enough, it was said, to pulverize every inch of German trench. Observers claimed even the birds had fled the sky. The ground trembled day and night. Soldiers could not sleep. The air smelled of burning cordite and iron. Haig's planners believed this bombardment would destroy all barbed wire, crush the German bunkers, and wipe out the defenders. The infantry would then advance in broad daylight, as if on parade, across no man's land, walking, not running, because there would be no resistance left. It was an industrial symphony of destruction, thousands of guns firing in sequence, the earth turned into molten soil. And yet, behind the German lines, the truth was very different. The Germans had spent 2 years fortifying their positions along the Somme. Their trenches were dug deep, up to 30 feet underground, reinforced with concrete, steel doors, and dugouts that could withstand direct shell hits. While the British thought they were annihilating the enemy, most German soldiers simply hid below, waiting. The artillery had failed in 2 critical ways. Many shells were defective and did not explode, and the barbed wire, rather than being cut, was tangled and even thicker. So when the bombardment stopped on July 1st, the Germans knew the attack was coming. They climbed back up from the bunkers, manned the machine guns, and prepared to fire. At 7:30 a.m., the British troops went over the top. Whistles blew all along the front, a sound that for many would be their last memory. The soldiers advanced in long, straight lines, packs on their backs, rifles slung, confident the enemy was gone. But as they reached the ridges, the German guns opened fire. Entire platoons vanished in seconds. At Serre, Beaumont Hamel, and Thiepval, men were cut down faster than they could move. Machine guns fired 500 rounds per minute, and the field turned into a storm of lead. By the end of that single day, the British had suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. The worst day in British military history. Some regiments lost 90% of their men within minutes. And yet, Haig ordered the offensive to continue. The Somme had failed to break through, but Haig refused to see it as a defeat. He called it a battle of attrition, a deliberate strategy to wear the enemy down. In reality, it was the transformation of the Western Front into an industrial testing ground. Each day, thousands more shells were fired, new guns were brought forward, and the line crept forward, sometimes by only a few hundred yards. The British learned new tactics, creeping barrages, coordinated artillery timing, and the first use of air reconnaissance to spot targets. They also began experimenting with armored vehicles, tanks, the world's first mechanical weapon of land assault. It was war not of movement, but of mechanization. Every advance was measured not in miles, but in bodies. By August, the Somme battlefield had become a landscape of ruin. Villages vanished. Forests became black skeletons. The mud itself was mixed with blood, iron, and bone fragments. Men fought for days in shell holes half filled with water. At night, the wounded cried from no man's land, unable to move. The constant shelling destroyed all landmarks. Even the rivers had changed course. The British used more ammunition in the first week of the Somme than in the entire Boer War. Each yard gained was bought with 1,000 shells. War had become an industry, and the soldiers its raw material. In September 1916, a new weapon appeared on the battlefield: the tank. Heavy, loud, and unreliable, these steel beasts were meant to crush wire and cross trenches. On September 15th, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, 49 tanks rolled forward with British infantry. They terrified the Germans at first, but most broke down before reaching the front. Still, the concept was revolutionary. For the first time, the battlefield was no longer dominated by men or horses, but by machines. It was the beginning of mechanized warfare, but also the proof that no machine could yet overcome the power of modern defense. By November 1916, after 4.5 months of fighting, the Battle of the Somme finally ended. The Allies had advanced barely 10 kilometers. Over 1.2 million men, British, French, and German, had been killed or wounded. Nothing decisive had been achieved. No great breakthrough. No collapse of German morale. But the Somme had changed everything. It had proven that the old tactics, frontal assaults, rigid plans, romantic courage, were useless in the age of industrial firepower. It had shown that artillery, not infantry, ruled the modern battlefield, and it had transformed the British Army from an amateur force into a professional war machine. The Somme was not fought by men alone. It was fought by machines. For the first time in history, an army was not simply a body of soldiers, but a system, an interconnected network of logistics, firepower, and industrial production. The battlefield was the visible tip of a vast mechanical iceberg. Behind every shell fired lay a factory, a railway line, a chain of workers. War had become a machine that fed on men and steel in equal measure. And at the heart of this machine was artillery, the god of the modern battlefield. By 1916, both sides understood that artillery, not infantry, was the decisive weapon. On the Somme, the British assembled over 1,400 heavy guns, ranging from field howitzers to massive 15-inch siege cannons. Each weapon had to be coordinated, supplied, and synchronized, a logistical feat unprecedented in human history. The bombardment that preceded the attack was meant to break the German line completely. It lasted 7 days and 7 nights, a storm of steel so intense that observers believed no living creature could survive. Yet for all its power, the bombardment failed in its purpose. British commanders believed that sheer volume of fire equaled destruction. But most shells were shrapnel, designed to kill exposed troops, not destroy bunkers. The Germans, safely hidden in deep dugouts, survived the storm with minimal losses. Fuse technology was outdated, and over 1/3 of shells failed to detonate. So when the artillery stopped and the whistles blew, the Germans were not dead. They were alive, angry, and ready. The British had built the largest artillery orchestra in history, but they played the wrong tune. Communication broke down almost instantly. When the infantry advanced, telephone lines were cut by shell fire, and runners carrying messages were killed before they could reach their destination. The war had become too vast and too chaotic for 19th century command systems to manage. Generals fought from maps while soldiers died in fog and mud. In the air, fragile biplanes began to change everything. For the first time, aircraft served as the eyes of the artillery, spotting targets, mapping enemy trenches, and photographing movements. It was dangerous, primitive, and revolutionary. The Somme became the first great battle fought in 3 dimensions: land, air, and the unseen world of coordination. For the soldiers, it was hell. They lived like ghosts among machines. Orders came from nowhere. Shells fell without warning. They existed in a world of thunder and mud, where courage and futility were indistinguishable. The Somme turned men into extensions of steel, disciplined, mechanized, and exhausted. At the top, Haig faced an impossible reality. Trained in cavalry tactics, he commanded an army of engines. He believed in willpower, in the offensive spirit, and refused to see that in the age of firepower, moral force could not defeat steel. Each failure was called progress. Each massacre was recorded as a lesson. And slowly, painfully, the British learned. By autumn, they had improved coordination between artillery and infantry, refined timing, and understood that combined arms, not courage, would win modern wars. The learning curve was paved with bodies. The irony was brutal. The British succeeded, but too late. By September, they finally learned how to fight industrial war effectively. And by then, hundreds of thousands were already dead. On the German side, the story was the same. Falkenhayn had underestimated Britain's capacity to sustain industrial slaughter. The continuous bombardments, even when tactically ineffective, shattered morale and exhausted reserves. Letters from German soldiers spoke of iron rain that never ceased and of comrades buried alive. Even victory meant annihilation. When the guns finally fell silent in November, the statistics told a story beyond comprehension. 1.2 million casualties, 10 kilometers gained. But behind those numbers lay something deeper, the death of an era. The Somme ended the age of heroic warfare. It proved that courage could no longer overcome technology, and that wars would henceforth be won not by glory, but by endurance and production. Strategically, the Somme achieved little ground, but changed everything else. It forced Germany to divert divisions from Verdun, weakened its offensive capacity, and pushed Britain into the central role on the Western Front. It taught every general that defense ruled, and that to break it, something beyond human bravery would be required. The armies themselves transformed. The British learned logistics, engineering, and synchronization. Factories at home became extensions of the battlefield. Railways and mathematics replaced horse and instinct. Men became components in a vast machine, efficient, organized, and inhuman. But amid the machinery, humanity cracked. Entire villages in England lost their sons. Regiments were erased in hours. The poet Siegfried Sassoon wrote, "I died in hell. They called it the Somme." The battlefield had become a graveyard before the war even ended. Politically, the Somme broke illusions. It turned war from adventure into obligation. It exposed the failure of old leadership and the blind faith in offensive spirit. Yet despite the losses, neither side retreated. Both believed endurance would bring victory. And in a way, it did, but not before reshaping the entire world. The lessons of the Somme birthed the doctrines that would define 20th century war. Creeping barrages, air-ground coordination, infiltration tactics, armored assaults. Out of the ashes of failure rose the blueprint for modern warfare. The Somme was the first true battle of the industrial age, where nations, not just armies, fought. It was a war of factories and coal, chemistry and steel. Progress became a weapon, and humanity its cost. When the war ended, the Somme became a symbol of courage, futility, and transformation. The white graves that stretch across its fields mark not just the dead, but the death of old ideals. Europe learned how to fight modern war, but also how to mourn it. They had called it an experiment, a test of courage, coordination, and firepower. And it succeeded. The guns worked. The machines advanced. But what they proved was not victory. It was extinction. At the Somme, humanity learned how to fight total war, but it also learned how to die by it. July 1916 was not the end of an offensive. It was the beginning of a new kind of world. A world where machines decide fate, and every advance is paid in flesh. The Somme Offensive was not a failure of courage. It was the triumph of machinery over humanity. And its echo still shakes the earth in every bomb that falls and every war that calls itself modern.